Bloodborne's campaign begins in the treatment room on the second story of Iosefka's clinic. The rest of this level can't be accessed due to the hallway door being locked, so the only path forward is to head downstairs. This leads into a more open space from which we can see a similarly inaccessible overhead balcony. With no other options, we head outside to the courtyard. From out here, a graveyard can be seen behind a locked gate. After exploring central Yharnam a little further, we circle around, coming to a dead-end street directly adjacent to the still inaccessible graveyard. Opposite this, we open a large gate. And though we've now looped back to Iosefka's clinic, the graveyard, the second-story hallway, and overhead balcony all remain unexplored. Much later in Bloodborne's campaign, the hunter traverses the Forbidden Woods, and tucked away behind a few caged animals, finds a cave entrance leading deep underground. Though first taking us through a somewhat linear path, this soon opens up into a huge cavern filled with various obstacles. Eventually tapering back down into a tighter cave, we come to an absolutely enormous ladder. Stopping short of reaching the surface, we pass through an underground burial chamber before climbing a second ladder. And reaching the top, the hunter finally arrives at the graveyard by Iosefka's clinic. There are two gates through which we can proceed, ahead being the unlockable shortcut looping back to the courtyard, and at the opposite end is an open gate which takes us down some stairs and through a rear alleyway. This leads into the backyard of the clinic. A ladder brings the hunter to the rooftops, which can be crossed, leading to an opening, finally giving us access into the second-story hallway of Iosefka's clinic. Exploring the second-story hallway reveals some character lore, as well as a staircase leading to a small treatment room on the third story, wherein we encounter the fake doctor. So, to summarize, we've now gained access to the graveyard, backyard, rooftops, and second-story hallway, all of which were inaccessible during the first act, but the overhead balcony remains unreachable. Having taken the time to summarize the entirety of Iosefka's clinic, let's now take a look at some of the earliest draft designs for the area which were created by the game design team for planning purposes. And it is here, within this third-story treatment room, that this early concept layout would have had the hunter's journey begin. Moving forward through the area, the layout of this third-story landing remains, for all intents and purposes, the same as what eventually made it into the final game. And continuing forward, throughout the rest of the second story hallway, the case is as much similar. The simple design language of these planning maps helps visualize scale, but the vast majority of the layout is a match across the board for now. The concept for an open window connecting the second story hallway to the rooftops had already been decided at this point. As we approach the hallway door leading to the room where the final version of Bloodborne begins, we discover that such a room did not exist at this stage of planning, resulting in the first major difference between the two layouts. In its absence, we'd instead immediately continue down the staircase leading to the first floor. Albeit simplified, the overhead balcony can be seen above this open space. Heading towards the exit, the antechamber and small staircase leading outside were also here, but let's briefly return to the second story hallway and explore the rooftops first. Considering that the early layout had the hunter begin in the third story treatment room, the rooftops, which would eventually only be accessible much later in the game, are actually traversible right from the start. However, this does not have as dramatic an impact on the world design as you might expect, as the entire backyard area did not exist in this concept for the world layout. Instead, in the distance, we can see an inaccessible yard full of trees, which would eventually become the graveyard in later versions, and it in no way connects to our current location. Rather, the rooftops existed for a different, much simpler reason. As you can see, with the starting room not yet having been built, the entire structure is somewhat shorter in length, meaning that from here we'd stand adjacent to a different part of the nearby building. In the final version, the outer wall of the starting room blocks the hunter from this position. Yet here, a quick roll would take us to an area that did not survive through to the final design. A smaller rooftop area adjoining the overhead balcony could be reached in this way, complete with broken window panes granting interior access. And so, per this earlier layout concept, we were able to traverse the overhead balcony above the clinic first floor open space, and even reach a small outdoor balcony off to the right. From here, we'd get an overview of the yard filled with trees, which would eventually evolve into the graveyard in a later design, once again seen here with no connecting backyard area. The remaining path forward simply involves plunging down to the first floor and continuing towards the exit. Now, where exiting the retail version of Iosefka's clinic would have led us to the courtyard connecting to the graveyard and main street, here we skip the courtyard entirely and step directly onto the main street, and we do so a little further down the path than would actually be accessible in the final layout. Continuing down the linear path, on our right we do eventually find the small area which would later evolve into the courtyard outside the clinic. Here just being a small closed off area with a shut gate leading to the yard full of trees. Conceptually, the layout remained similar in the final game, but the interconnected nature of this opening segment had simply not yet been wholly fleshed out. Regardless, with the iconic view of the Great Bridge in the distance, the hunter continues to the right and into central Yharnam. The large shortcut gate which would eventually lead back to this area had already been decided upon, as well as the ladder which would lead up to where we meet Gilbert in the final game. Continuing through central Yharnam, down the streets which loop back to the clinic, we see this large shortcut gate from the opposite side, while to the left is the dead-end street adjacent to the graveyard. However, in this test map design, this is not actually a dead end, as an opening leads into the yard full of trees, which would eventually evolve into the graveyard. As mentioned, there's no connecting backyard path in this layout, so regardless of this different method for accessing this side area, there would for now be no intuitive reason for this area to exist, at least with regard to world design. At least the gate, which would lead back to the courtyard, can be reached, providing some degree of interconnectivity. Some parts of this layout were actually implemented into the game during the pre-alpha stage of Bloodborne's playtesting, which can be seen here, partially reassembled from what data remains available. As we saw, the second story hallway did not connect to the starting room, as that room did not exist at this point in development, and we instead would have come directly to the main staircase connecting the first and second floor. Hence, if we were to step outside onto the rooftops, we here too would find a similar match to the test map's design. The rooftops lined up with the adjacent structure in a way that allowed the hunter to walk directly across the two, from where the open window leading to the overhead balcony would become accessible. From here, work would continue, and in the next test map file, we can see a small step forward in the world layout evolution. The second story treatment room in which the game begins would be drafted into the world design, now interrupting the second story hallway and the large staircase just as it would in the final version. This means that if we head to the outside rooftops, now along a newly added small ramp, this adjustment has bled over into the concept for accessing the overhead balcony. You might assume that this would be the point where it was decided that the balcony would no longer be accessible, as it did previously appear that the addition of the starting room was what had blocked access to the nearby rooftops in later versions. However, this test map shows an adjusted rooftop design which allowed for both ideas to coexist. The hunter could jump to a small ledge, and then travel along to the adjacent rooftop area, which in this version has been further embellished with some added detail. Traversing the indoor, overhead balcony in this version, not much had changed, though a view outside from up here shows that the outdoor layout had been adjusted a little, with the yard full of trees being slightly offset compared to before. This is because, stepping outside the clinic via the front door, we'd now find a world layout matching much more closely to what would become the final design, bringing us directly to the courtyard which connects the rear yard to the central Yharnam streets. Despite this, the dead end adjacent to the graveyard did still have a small opening leading to the rear yard, which would not be the case in the retail design. By the time of the Bloodborne network test, this particular concept, which incorporated the starting room, yet still allowed for the overhead balcony to be accessed, had been abandoned. In the network test, we see that the adjustment to the rooftop area caused by the starting room's existence simply pushes the adjacent rooftops out of range, and they can only be reached by disabling player gravity. Though, seen here from a distance, an item was placed on the outdoor balcony at this point, despite it being inaccessible. Having taken a look at some number of variations, let's quickly summarize what we've learned here. Early design concepts for Bloodborne, as seen in grey box testing maps, show that the game began in what would eventually become the room where we encounter the fake doctor. Because of this, the outdoor rooftops were, at the time, accessible right from the beginning of the game, but their role was simplified into just being an alternate path into the room where we encounter the game's first enemy. The player would have had a choice: run directly through the second-story hallway, down the stairs and into the room with the first enemy encounter, attacking it from behind, or use the rooftops to access the balcony overhead the first enemy and attack from above. But once Bloodborne's starting room had been created, the layout changed, the second-story hallway would be locked until much later in the campaign, and the overhead balcony pushed aside, becoming unreachable. Though the concept for a version of Iosefka's clinic which accommodated both the starting room and overhead balcony never left the testing phase, a much more important iteration upon the world design can be seen when we first load into this particular test map. Because when doing so, we don't actually appear anywhere in Iosefka's clinic as we had in the first test map we explored. The hunter instead begins in the Forbidden Woods, standing right outside the cave entrance leading underground. Indeed, this test map was specifically created to plan out a connection between the Forbidden Woods and the rooftops of Iosefka's clinic. Heading inwards, where in the final version we would have descended deep into a subterranean poisoned swamp, this earlier design remained relatively close to the surface. And while still being set within what appears to be some kind of cave system, here we would have explored a more artificially carved motif. As these developer testing maps existed mostly for drafting layouts, it can be difficult to interpret exactly what we would have seen had this particular iteration been brought into the final world design. Regardless, having passed through a somewhat open underground space, we would have travelled up a ramp towards a gate, somewhat matching the one we had seen at the cave entrance, here denoting an exit. The antechamber opens up, leading to a huge ladder, similar in concept to the final version. And though not immediately obvious visually, we would have found ourselves passing through alleyways between tightly packed buildings. A second, even taller ladder then took the hunter to the rooftops of these buildings. And we'd see here that these are in fact the outdoor rooftops of Iosefka's clinic, giving us the first glimpse into concepts for a hidden path connecting the Forbidden Woods to central Yharnam. Though without a backyard area or any connection to what would eventually become the graveyard, and with the overhead balcony still being accessible, there would yet be some number of redesigns through which this would all come. Going back to an alpha version of Bloodborne from around the time of the network test version, about 4 months before the game was set to release, we can see how FROMSOFTWARE iterated along this path. Here in the Forbidden Woods, before entering the hidden cave system, we'd come across a warp chair placed along the path. This actually existed for playtesting purposes during this unfinished design phase. Interacting with the warp chair, we quickly discover the reason for its placement here. During this playtesting phase, the hunter would be instantly warped from the cave entrance to the rooftops of Iosefka's clinic, bypassing the cave system entirely. This shows us how a concept for this loop back to the game's opening area was now being brought into the alpha version's world design. Still, the backyard area did not exist 4 months prior to the game's release. And further to this, there were no ladders leading down from the rooftops whatsoever, somewhat isolating them from the overworld layout. Additionally, at this stage, the adjacent rooftops and second-story balcony cannot be reached, as the clinic starting room had been implemented, pushing the structure further out, and barring any such access. Interesting here is that if we take a look over the edge where we'd eventually be able to reach the backyard, there is a very long ladder placed out of bounds, suggesting that a future concept was already taking shape somewhere in the design process. So, considering that a warp chair teleported the hunter to the rooftops, meaning they weren't accessible through normal world traversal 4 months before release, we're left wondering exactly what purpose is served by the underground cave system in the Forbidden Woods. Using another warp chair placed on the rooftops to return to the Forbidden Woods, we'd find an answer. The cave system, at this time, followed a somewhat simple path, slowly taking the hunter along a carved route without dipping particularly far underground. As the overhead rafters come to an end, the cave opens up a little, where a pool and some stalactites show off a decent amount of effort that's gone into fleshing out this alpha version design. Continuing up a gentle slope, we start to approach the surface and notice here a ladder haphazardly placed clipping through the ceiling. This is not the same ladder we saw earlier down below the clinic rooftops, but it clearly exists in parallel, suggesting that eventually ladders will play a role in combining these two paths. Taking a few steps forward, we see that there are some technical issues at this point in the layout design, as no pre-caching was set up for this interconnection, causing Central Yharnam to load in haphazardly. Regardless, after giving the world a moment to load in, we can emerge from this cave system to see that it does lead us into the graveyard area, similar to how it would in the final version. The gate leading to the clinic courtyard is here, solidifying this path as a shortcut back to the game's opening area. However, as mentioned, the backyard path did not exist yet, and the graveyard was otherwise wholly disconnected from the clinic rooftops, further justifying the use of temporary warp chairs for that aspect of world traversal. Despite the unfinished nature of this iterative design, the overall concept for the layout was now fleshed out. A hidden cave in the Forbidden Woods would lead players to the graveyard, which would open access to both the clinic courtyard and rooftops. 2 months later, for all intents and purposes, work was completed on the interconnected nature of this path. The cave was fleshed out into what we would find in the final version, with a pair of ladders taking the hunter directly to the graveyard, a rear gate was added here, leading into what was a newly created backyard path, and this would lead players upwards to the clinic rooftops. The playtesting warp chair did still exist on the rooftops at this point in development, but interacting with it would now simply send players into the void, crashing the game, as it no longer had any placeholder role to play. In the end, across so many design changes, all of this would coalesce into one of the most memorable examples of FROMSOFTWARE's looping world design. And while we never did get to traverse the second-story balcony in the end, it is at least fascinating to see how Iosefka's clinic would change so much throughout the process of Bloodborne's design. As some of you have noticed, this video took well over a year to create, and I appreciate the supporters that have helped justify the huge amount of work that goes into these projects. If you'd like to help support the creative nature of these analyses, please consider making a once-off donation by clicking the thanks button below this video. Alternatively, you might consider support on an ongoing basis by using the join button, or via the relevant link in the description, just as the folks seen on screen here have chosen to. In the meantime, please feel free to follow me on twitch.tv/Lance McDonald, where you can talk with me and our community about video games live every day. Please take a moment to read the description on this video, and thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.